thanking and praising God, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit for the way in which they can help us better understand our why, something we've talked about from time to time, meaning another way of stating our recurrent theme of purpose. Why am I doing what it is that I am motivated to do, what I have an ambition for, or what it is that I've just fallen into the habit of doing? This is one of those chapters that I want to call Build, because God willing, Paul's words of advice to the Corinthian church, helping them understand why they have their spiritual gifts, will help us likewise understand our why a little bit more. But along that concept of build, he is going to talk in the first 5 verses about this whole concept of building, understanding that they have spiritual gifts. They have disputes over their spiritual gifts. There are, in fact, distinctions in the spiritual gifts, and he is going to help them understand that prophecy is one that they should actually want more than at least tongues. Why? Because he is going to say tongues have the effect of building up the individual, whereas prophecy has the effect of building up the church, a recurring theme he is going to develop throughout this entire chapter, with the exception of maybe the last few verses. Understanding that after verse 4 in that first section draws that contrast between a tongue building up the individual with the gift, as opposed to the prophecy building up the church at large. He's going to give them an illustration of that in verses 6 through 12, where he is going to talk about things like flutes and harps and bugles, where even though they're just inanimate instruments, if they are not played intelligibly, they're in some ways useless. And so he's going to talk about that just as inanimate instruments need to be played intelligibly, so do God's people. And so for that reason, they need to look at their spiritual gifts for the value that they have in building up others in verse 12, saying the priority once again is to strive to excel in building up the church. I just noticed that, not just to build up the church, but to excel in that, as opposed to simply, as we've talked about in past discussions, just being kind of there or present in doing it, being present and trying to strive for excellence in building up the body in general. As verses 13 through 19 are going to say tongues can be done or spoken in that way if there is an interpreter present to make sure that those who are hearing the person who is speaking the tongue are not simply applauding the skill with which they are speaking a tongue, but they're actually getting understanding from it. And so over and over, he is going to say in that section of verses, in verse, I think it's 15, twice in verse 15, he's going to talk about the way that the mind needs to be developed as your gift is being used, or the mind of others is being developed. So likewise, he's going to sum up that section in verse 19 by saying he would rather speak 5 words with his mind in order to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue in the absence of an interpreter. Once again, going to the distinction between vain talents and talents and gifts that are actually productive. Go back to that illustration later, but in verses 20 through 25, he is going to talk about the whole concept of their need to mature, understanding that in the earliest chapters, he talked about the fact that they had knowledge and that they had gifts and they were quite confident in those gifts, but those gifts lacked practicality, meaning they had idle knowledge that was not actually producing a whole lot. And so now he is helping them to understand that as they have grown proud of their gifts, once again, it's like the illustration we mentioned of having a nice custom car part on display, maybe in a display window or shown off in a store. But if you could have sentience, or if you could project a mind onto that car part, and that car part's greatest ambition was to simply be admired in the showroom, it would lack the understanding that its full purpose was actually on an automobile, not to be applauded and admired. And so in many ways, he's saying that's the attitude they have towards their gifts. They're really proud about the gifts, but they're not using them in any way that's actually moving the church at Corinth forward effectively. And so much like a car part that is just kind of vain on display, he's saying, understand why you have the gifts. And now, as we saw before, strive to excel in actually putting them to use effectively. As he's going to continue on in verses 26 through 33, not simply scolding them for the ways in which they are lacking in the use of their gifts, to help them understand how to better use them, especially the gift of tongues. And so after telling them that they need to have an interpreter present, he's going to give them the method for effectively speaking in tongues and having the interpretation done so that the church can be built up. Once again, that term showing up in verse 26, the whole concept of building up. As he is then going to go on in verses, what's that, 30, the end of verse 33 through verse 35, to shift his focus to go beyond talking about how how speaking should be done in the church, to talk about who should speak. And this is a more controversial passage today. I don't think it's quite as controversial for that time, but if the question's coming up, it's probably at least a burgeoning issue in the early church. It's a big issue now, but he is going to say at the end of verse 33, as in all the churches of the saints, in the same way or similar way that he addressed them regarding head coverings. A few chapters back, he is going to say the women should keep silent. That is Paul, that is not me. But he is going to say it's not just Paul, it is a command of the Lord. By the time he gets to that last section, verses 36 through 40, that's literally what he is going to say in verse 37. And like we said, that goes back to the way that he addressed them about the whole issue of head coverings. He is saying if the church at Corinth has an issue about head coverings, that's a Corinth issue. That is not a Churches of Christ issue, because the churches, all of the churches, he is saying at that time, had a uniform rule with regard to head coverings. And likewise, he's appealing to that same thing, going one step further to say not only is there a uniform rule about making sure that the women are silent in the speaking roles in the church, it seems that he's alluding to, but he's likewise saying this is a command of God, going even further back to what he talked about when he was, or what he said when he was distinguishing his own opinion from the rules that God gave for marriage, specifically divorce and remarriage. I think it's back in chapter 7. And so now he is combining two tools to help them understand God's will, helping them understand the uniform rule of the church with regard to women in speaking roles in the church, at least the first century church, which is the only church that I know about, the Church of God. Specifically, we call it the Church of Christ. But likewise, he is going to say that beyond the tradition, it's a command of God. And if they have true prophets there, they would know that. And so I am not considering myself an expert on, I just learned this term this week. I've heard it before, but complementarianism. Oh, I am not trying to wade off into those waters, but I do believe that, as one of our dear brothers back in the day used to say, I do believe that the Bible is right. And I can feel confident in saying this, that our modern disputes about women in speaking roles is a modern, or it's a trend, it's a product of the modern church. It is not a product of the Church of Christ as God gave it to us. And I'm not using Church of Christ as the organized group of believers that I belong to. I'm talking about the Church of Christ that God established. There was no other tradition in the churches of Christ. And I welcome correction on that issue because even though peaceable disagreement seems to be going out of style, I still believe that it's possible. And so I believe that it's possible to have a discussion on this issue. And even if we disagree, it's possible that we can both be or all be improved by having the discussion agreeably, God willing. But that is not the issue that stood out to me most. The larger issue that caught my attention going through chapter 14 is the way in which they had become content as showpieces in a showroom, not having any greater ambition to actually get on a functioning car. And that seems to be not just a relevant word for the church at Corinth, the church at Corinth, that seems to be a relevant word for today. Why? Because it seems that not only had they lost touch with the fact that the way that they were going about speaking in tongues was lacking in its ability to actually build up the church, they were losing touch with, by the time we get to, like we said, verses 20 through 25, they had lost touch with the fact that the way that they were speaking in tongues was potentially damaging God's work amongst unbelievers and outsiders. Verse 24, but if all prophecy and an unbeliever or an outsider enters, he is convicted by all, and he is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. In contrast to the part that I looked over, I think it was verse 23, where he says, if therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues, and the outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you are out of your minds? And that's one of the concerns I have with, even though I have friends who believe in the manifestations of the spiritual gifts, and we all believe that, but they believe that they still have the gift of tongues today. And one of the reasons why they consider the gift of tongues still being important today is that they believe that without it, you really can't tell whether or not you actually have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. One of the reasons that concerns me is because I have yet to see the gift of tongues that my friends believe that they are displaying actually spoken in the way that Paul says that they should be. And so it seems to beg the question that absent interpretation, how are you, one, building up the church? A question that Paul raises, or an issue that he prioritizes over and over again in chapter 14. And then maybe just as importantly, how are you actually helping to build a bridge or bridge the gap between God and the outsiders and unbelievers that he is trying to reach, when quite possibly the tongues are being spoken in a way that might actually damage their ability to accept the truth that God exists and that your gift is a representation or evidence of that, in the way that he says prophecy properly done makes it clear to an unbeliever that God exists and the prophet is real. Understand that prophecy, modern prophecy, can be a problem too, which expands that out, because it's not just tongues errantly used. It's not just prophecy pretentiously spoken, which really represents false prophecy. It's the way that it seems to be more and more difficult to find what I call verse 4 believers, or 1 Corinthians 14, verse 4 believers. Those who, regardless of your belief about tongues or prophecy, prioritize the way that not only their gifts, but their lives are actually building up what God is doing through the church. And it seems even more rare to find verse 24 believers, those who are consistently considering the way that both their gifts and their lives are actually reconciling the distance between God and everyone that he's trying to reach, especially the outsiders and the unbelievers. It's more common to find verse 23 believers, those who, whether it's in speaking tongues or just the way they live their lives or display their gifts, those who may unknowingly be doing damage to the work that God is doing through us to reconcile with outsiders and unbelievers. Which is why we sometimes say God's best to you as you go forward with him. And as we likewise sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please give us the strength to yield to everything that you're trying to do in our lives to help get us off of the showroom and onto the car that is effectively moving your work forward.